Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Homestead. And as you can see, today's topic is Mexicanos in the Gilded Age. Don't worry, we'll define Gilded Age in a minute. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off with discussing the Reconstruction Era of America. And this is a vitally important formative time in U.S. history. However, one of the big things to understand is that in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the United States had a very active federal government, dominated by these so-called radical Republicans. I say so-called, this is what they're called in history, but they were radical because they had the audacity to believe that African Americans deserve equal rights, which should be normal. And they fought for increased equality and equal civil rights. This is what this era is known as. And the result of this is that we have a drastically different looking government. Again, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was theoretically designed to increase the role of the federal government, allowing the federal government to take control of things like enforcement of civil rights. We saw this with the Reconstruction Amendments. We also would see this with things like imposing an income tax to pay for these programs, like the Freedmen's Bureau that was designed during the Reconstruction era. However, that agenda is all going to end in 1877. We discussed that last time. Now, one of the things we did not discuss is the reasons why it ends. And a lot of it is political, but one of the major reasons that the political change takes place, that the troops are removed from the South, was because of a huge recession that occurred in the 1870s. There's a panic of 1873 that's still being felt during the election of 1876. And the South seized on this recession, this economic calamity. And they begin to cry a very familiar term to us in this day and age, which is the term socialism. That is, they begin to cry that these programs of the radical Republican government, these programs designed to help formerly enslaved African Americans, all these programs was the taking of tax money, stealing the money via taxes from hardworking whites and redistributing it into these support programs to help these formerly enslaved African Americans. But they phrased it in such that it was stealing the hardworking money of poor whites and redistributing that wealth to undeserving poor people of color. And this they called socialism. Now, this is not true socialism. By definition, socialism is the government taking over the means of production. So if the government takes over the railroad industry, that is socialism. If the government is controlling, say, the public school system, paid for by tax dollars, that is socialism, which we have in the United States. Like, we accept some socialist ideas. In this case, though, what they're crying is a redistribution of wealth. They're yelling this and screaming this at middle class and poorer whites. But what they're upset about is taking the money from hardworking whites themselves and being redistributed to poor people of color who in their minds are undeserving. They're lazy, they don't deserve it, they're not educated, they're not working. Well, they can't get educated, they can't get jobs until there's programs put in place to help them because they were formerly enslaved. And the result of this, however, is it works. In 1876, the Democrat Samuel Tilden is technically leading the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, but there's disputed electoral votes. And basically, the Republicans and Democrats cut a backdoor deal called the Compromise of 1877, wherein Democrats agree to give Rutherford B. Hayes the victory in exchange for removing federal troops from the South. This is the oversimplified, easy version of this. But by doing so, it changes the way the government works. No longer is an active federal government. It's a government that turns a blind eye to the atrocities of Jim Crow and Juan Crow in the South. It also leads to the next 30 years almost of political stalemate from the 1870s through 1900. So let me show you what this means now in practice. So let's look at politics post 1877. And what we see here is we have two very clearly defined political parties. We have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republicans portray themselves as the party of morality. They are the party of Lincoln. They are the abolitionists. Now, traditionally, they're still the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP. But they also bring in African Americans and Union veterans because, again, they were on the side of the North during the Civil War. They fought for abolition. They get both the black vote and the veteran vote. The reality is, while they're generally supportive of civil rights, they're kind of moderate, really. Again, these are not the radical Republicans of the Reconstruction era. These are moderate Republicans. They do favor a strong, active government in theory, but in reality, what they face is big business. They favor big businesses. They favor these new corporations that develop, as we'll see in a few minutes. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, portray themselves as the party of the common man or the working man. These are generally your Southern racist whites. These are your ethnic immigrants and the working class. By and large, their defining characteristic, though, is they are racist and very unsupportive of anything to do with civil rights. They are white supremacists. And they phrase this or they cloak this in the term states' rights. Now, the reality is they still generally support the wealthy, much like the Republican Party does. And of course, I love the quote on the bottom from a Democrat of the era that says, "A Republican is a man who wants you to go to church every Sunday." A Democrat says if a man wants to have a glass of beer on a Sunday, he can have it. Unless you're in Texas before noon on Sundays. Inside joke. Now, both political parties would also attract Mexicanos and Mexican Americans here. In fact, the Republican Party had a very strong branch of or demographic of Mexican Americans. They were fall in the category of El Club Mexicano Republicano. Again, a Mexican Republican club. And they generally supported the same ideals. At the same time, a number of Mexicanos began to align themselves with the Democratic Party. And they did this for practical reasons. And this is important to understand because in the South, if you were Republican, you did not win elections. The Democratic Party was the only party in the South that could win an election. From the 1860s all the way through the 1960s, for 100 years, Republicans did not win in the South. If you were in those Southern Confederate states, the former Confederate states, you better be Democrat if you hope to hold public office, for the most part. Very few exceptions. And therefore, often Mexican Americans would align themselves with the Democratic Party because their bastion of support is the South. They live in the South. And Republicans didn't win in the South. And in doing so, they tried to align themselves with whiteness. And so El Club Democrata Mexicana, or Mexicano, would be the Democratic Mexican Party of the South. And again, hundreds and thousands of Mexicanos are going to align themselves with the Democratic Party. because it was the only way to win an election if you want to hold public office in the South, and B, because in doing so, they could align themselves with whiteness and try to kind of separate themselves from blackness, and hopefully to gain some acceptance. Again, legally, they were always white. But the result of this political party split created in this Gilded Age period a political stalemate. With very few exceptions, the president was a crappy president, as I call them, but by design. The president felt he should do nothing. The prevailing theory of the time was that the president should only obey and enforce the laws. It was entirely incumbent upon Congress to make laws. That's changed in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, this was by design, again, during the Gilded Age period. Now, again, from Abraham Lincoln through the 1870s, this was an active federal government. Income taxes, they're heavily involved. But in the 1870s, that switches. And from the 1870s through 1900, there is nothing going on from the White House. The problem is, nothing's going on in Congress either. Again, with very few exceptions, during the Gilded Age period from the 1870s to 1900, Democrats controlled the House, Republicans controlled the Senate, because there were more northern states than southern states. And thus, this party split in the House and Senate meant there's a stalemate. Nothing gets done. Very little is passed. And again, this is largely by design. They believe that they were adhering to the old ideas of Adam Smith and capitalism of laissez-faire economics. The government should stay out of things. Now, as we're going to see, that's not really the case. Laissez-faire economics never actually existed. But that's what they said they did. And so the reality was, as a result of this stalemate, for the average American, whether you are white, black, or brown, the status quo of politics during this era was just not working. And as a result, we start seeing new political parties emerge at a grassroots level, starting with what was called the Alliance Movement that would evolve into what became the Populist Party. Now, populism is this idea of it's a general political philosophy that arises from the grassroots, that comes around. It's a secular pattern throughout history that arises whenever the common person feels the government is not meeting their needs. And it supports the common person over the interests of the elites against the current status quo. In other words, it's the common average person rising up politically. Now, this started in Texas with what was called the Alliance Movement. And it was a bunch of farmers who began to push against the status quo, believing that the status quo of politics was adversely impacting them. And they saw collective action as the only way to seek relief from the cycle of debt and poverty. And this would be supported by large numbers of Mexicano farmers as a way for them not only to improve their situation, likewise with Anglos, but also to achieve greater equality and inclusion. In other words, what they are demanding is that the government do more to help the average American. They accused big businesses of being corrupt. They believe that big businesses were corrupting democracy, and that the businessmen had little concern for the average Americans, except, as they said, as raw material to be served up for the twin gods of production and profit. This populist movement that arises with the Alliance Movement embraces government regulations. Because they said, if you don't regulate and put restrictions on big businesses, the average American is hurt. And out of this Alliance Movement is formed a new political third party known as the Populist Party. Now, in 1892, they're going to run a political candidate for president who will be unsuccessful. But look at their laundry list of things they believe in. Number one, they believe in the unlimited minting of silver. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a minute because this is a very complicated thing that students tend to have a hard time understanding, but it's important to understand. They also believed in the direct election of senators. Up until 1913, we the people did not vote for our state senators. Our state legislators did that. And they wanted to make government more responsive to the people, thus direct election of senators. Again, it makes sense in modern day. This was something they had to fight for. They wanted a graduated income tax. In other words, it's unfair that across the board that everyone pays 5%, because 5% is a lot more money to a poor person than it is to a millionaire. And we will have our first millionaires in the Gilded Age. And yeah, 5% is 5%. That seems like a fair idea, but 5% is a lot more tangible money to a poor person than it is to a rich person. They want wealthier people to pay a higher percent, graduated income tax. They advocated for an 8-hour workday. Again, up to this point, we'll talk about in a minute, the average workday was 12 hours a day. They were nativists. They were very anti-immigration. And again, this was mostly against Asians and some Eastern Europeans. They still largely favored Mexican immigration because they were migrant workers in the South. These were mostly farmers. They also wanted the government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone. This is, in fact, a form of socialism, that the government would take over the ownership of these. And they did so for logical reasons, though, in their minds at least. They said that railroads were unfair because as private businesses, they were charging poor farmers more money than they were wealthy farmers who could afford to cut deals and deal in larger volume. It's kind of the same thing if you think about modern day. What are rights versus what are privileges? And what they were arguing back then was that use of railroads, the really only major form of transportation, use of the telephone and telegraph, these should be rights of all citizens, not the privileges of a select wealthy few. You can have the same conversation today when in regards to healthcare. Should only the wealthy be able to afford good healthcare in the United States? Or should it be a right of all people? Or if healthcare is too heavy of a subject for you, what about Wi-Fi, broadband internet? If the pandemic of COVID has taught us anything, is that having stable, good, high-speed internet is vital in the 21st century. But the reality is, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that we are a very unequal system where the wealthier families were able to provide for their students to learn from home during the pandemic. Whereas poorer students who didn't have access to quality internet suffered, sometimes being forced to go back to school early and face, a pandemic face to face rather than being able to learn from home as a result. So is broadband internet a right of all Americans to have equal access to education and technology and internet, to have access to information, or is it a privilege of a select few? Now back to the unlimited minting of coinage of silver here. So what the farmers wanted here was that have the government print more and more and more coins. Now, you should know that if you print more money, it causes inflation. But this is what the farmers wanted. Because what they said, the problem was at the beginning of the harvest season, the growing season, they would borrow money. And then they would grow their crops. And then when they harvested, they would sell the crops and then use that money they bring in to pay back that debt. So let's say, for instance, you borrowed $500 in March. You grow your crops, you buy your equipment, you harvest in October, and you sell your stuff for $600. Well, you pay back your $500 debt, you pocket $100 profit. But what if that same $500 you invested in March was then caused by unlimited minting of or coinage of silver, was then caused inflation over the summer. So when you sell your crops, that same number, you grew the same amount of crop, but instead of selling it for $600, you're going to sell for $800 thanks to inflation because all the prices have gone up by 1/3. And so now you bring in $800, you still pay back the same $500 you borrowed because inflation does not count part of your debt that you actually borrow from the bank. And therefore you profit now $300. And so they want this to help pay off their debts because much like we talked about sharecropping, it's a cycle of debt. Well, inflation theoretically could help alleviate that. Now, these are radical ideas. In fact, some of these things, like government ownership of utilities, like your heating, like electricity, like broadband internet, are still radical today. Things like the 8-hour workday will take another 50 years to get. Things like a graduated income tax are still under attack. These are radical ideas. And ultimately, in both 1892 and 1896, the Populist Party will not be successful in winning the presidency. And ultimately, by 1896, the Populist Party will be subsumed by the Democratic Party. But there will be a lasting impact. Not only will many of these ideas, like direct election of senators, like the 8-hour workday, like no child labor, not only will these ideas get embraced in the reform movements of the early 20th century, but they will also be successful at the local level, getting local leaders elected and appointed. This would include some Mexicanos who would embrace the Democratic Party, including Miguel Antonio Otero. Now, here is Miguel Antonio Otero II. He is going to be appointed by President William McKinley to be the 16th territorial governor of New Mexico. He will serve from 1897 through 1906. Now, he was an American politician, a businessman, and author. He was also the son of Miguel Antonio Otero I, who was a prominent New Mexican politician and businessman. But here's the thing. I told you how they tried to achieve whiteness, right, for acceptance. Otero's, the man pictured here, is the second. His father, Otero I, being a prominent New Mexican businessman and politician, had long pushed for the adoption of American culture. In fact, he eschewed or hated, loathed Mexican culture. Even during the Mexican-American War, he sided with the Americans because he saw it as an attempt to achieve whiteness and acceptance, hoping that his lighter skin, his large land holdings, and his business acumen, his wealth, would propel him to acceptance. And in some respects, it works. Now, President William McKinley, Republican, who favors big business, will appoint a big business Mexicano who seemed respectable enough to this position of honor as territorial governor. And yes, this is a win for Mexicanos in theory. But when Otero tries to run for higher office in 1912, the Republican Party will reject him and he will switch to the new Progressive Party that will succeed the Populist Party, who likewise the Progressive Party will feel the common man is not suiting their needs. But these are relatively modest gains, especially politically. And this still holds at the premise that the government was not working for the average person. And that idea, that premise will begin to spread across the nation and will start to give hope to average, everyday working class during this historical period known as the Gilded Age. Now, this Gilded Age period, it's a nebulous period. You could say it lasts from 1865 to 1900 because the Gilded Age is mostly referring to the North and Northeast. Now, the term the Gilded Age, I keep using that term, it was coined by Mark Twain himself in 1873 in a satirical piece called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. in which it portrays the United States as a society that is thinly gilded in gold. Now, that's what gilded means. Gilded means that something is plated in a valuable material like gold. So you can take like a piece of iron and cover it in a thin layer of gold and say, I got a gold ring or I got a gold necklace. Well, it's not really gold, it's gold plated. And so Mark Twain describes America during this period as gilded. In other words, it looks shiny. All this new technology, all this new big business, it all looks so grand and good and wonderful. Industrialization, steel, skyscrapers. But underneath all of that pretty veneer, pretty shiny gilded material is decay, societal, social, economic problems. Or as I put it very simply, the Gilded Age, it's gold-plated crap. Because underneath the shiny veneer of what looks like a growth period of the United States, and it is, economically it is decay and suffering for the average working class American. And what you find here is that the balance of power in the United States shifts after the Civil War. It shifts from the formerly rich plantation enslavers of the South to the rich industry, factory, railroad, oil, mine owners, mainly located in the North and Northeast, with some mines, of course, in the West, Southwest. And what happens is this is a tremendous period of wealth gap increasing. During this period, you see on the map here, on the screen, what happens is the wealth gap between rich and poor grows drastically. In fact, in the United States, 51%, the top 1% of the population controlled and owned 51% of the wealth. Think about that for a minute. The top 1% control 51% of the wealth. The top 12% of the country controlled 86% of the wealth. In other words, all of the nation's physical assets were held by a relatively small handful of families. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the J.P. Morgan. And these rich business tycoons, these so-called captains of industry, these robber barons, they amassed their wealth by, yes, being on the forefront of technology, but also by keeping wages ultra low. And of course, this was aided by a huge influx of immigrants who were willing to work for low wages. Worse than the wages, however, were the working conditions. The average work week was 59 hours. That's at least 6 10-hour days. Again, usually have Sundays off for church. Again, this is average. Many factories, especially steel mills, you work 12-hour days, 7 days a week. That's more than 84 hours a week. Not only were you paid bad, I'm talking less than 10 cents an hour, the conditions were hazardous. In fact, it is said that the United States led the world in workplace accidents and deaths. Coal mines are some of the worst places to be, with collapses, explosions, and dangerous underground gases. And again, this is all because of a lack of government regulation. This is unfettered, unchecked capitalism that takes place during the Gilded Age. But again, what choice do workers have? Do you quit? Because if you do, you ain't getting a better job. They're all bad. And if you don't have a job, you starve to death, you and your family. So as you can imagine, workers become pretty resentful of owners, pretty resentful of big business. But despite this, whenever the government does eventually get involved, and again, they say laissez-faire, hands off, but that's not true. The government would get involved, and they would side with the business owners. And so workers take it upon themselves, often through what's called labor strikes. Now, I assume you all know what a strike is, but in case you don't, a strike is when you withhold your labor. So you're working, you're upset, you want things to change at your workplace, so you go on strike. You stop working. You go outside the plant, you block the entrance, you carry signs that try to tell people there's a problem here, and you what's called picket in front of the building back and forth to prevent new workers from entering, and you try to draw attention to the fact that you are being exploited. Now, the hope is by withholding your labor that the businessmen will cave in and negotiate a better wage or better work condition. The problem is the owners have all the power. They bring in new workers, which is why you block the plant or block the factory or block the mine. But as we're going to see, there's going to be a number of these strikes, and it usually ends badly for the workers. One of the first early strikes, major strikes in U.S. history, is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So during July of 1877, remember, this is caused by the panic of 1873, the economic downturn that led to this whole great compromise, or the Conference of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. Basically what happens, we're in 4 years into a recession, and the Baltimore and B&O railroads in the East Coast cut wages by 10%. The third time in 5 years they've cut wages. The workers said, we have enough, we are going on strike. And the strike initially works. It paralyzes the train industry, the railroad industry in the East. The railway owners called the state governors, and the state governors sent in the state militias to force the workers back to work, to break the strikes. In Pittsburgh, the militia gets in a firefight with the workers, killing 20 laborers. The strike will last 45 days until finally the president, Rutherford B. Hayes, sends in the U.S. military, sending them from city to city, putting the strike down by force. In total, more than 26 people die, all workers. This is followed in 1892 with the Homestead steel strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh. The Homestead Steel Mill. Andrew Carnegie, owner of the mill, left the country, put his second in command in charge, leaves the country, and then his second in command cuts wages. And once again, the Pennsylvania governor sends in the Pennsylvania state militia for 95 days. The entire time protecting the steel mill, not helping the workers. And once again, the strike ends in failure. Or take the Pullman strike in 1894 in Pullman, Illinois. Employees of the railroad company are once again, they are forced to live in company housing. And when the company lays off 3,000, almost half their labor force, they cut wages by 40%. But yet the rent of the houses did not change. The workers go on strike. President Grover Cleveland sends in the federal troops once again, with 12 people dying in the violence. Again, the strike ends with no changes for the workers. Now, in the wake of all these strikes, we're going to see the awakening of a labor movement, of what's called the union movement. Now, unions, all they are is a collective of workers. In other words, workers band together. Now, individually, workers have very little power. They only have power if they can collectively join together. A union is an organization then that will represent the workers when they negotiate with the owners. Because what happens is, without a union, workers can owners can try to divide the workers. and say, well, I'll offer you this, but I'm only offering black people this price or Mexicanos this wage. This is a way to collectively bargain, collectively negotiate for better work conditions, better wages. And in 1869, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a new labor union, a national labor union, is formed, known as the Knights of Labor. Now, they are quite unique. Now, their early leader is going to be a man by the name of Terence Powderly, who's very much someone who believes in equal rights. They are a national labor union. And after the Great Railway Strike, they are going to expand dramatically. Look at some of the things they believe in, though. They oppose the current wage labor system. They also, however, are not just elitist, because some unions will only unionize workers who are known as skilled laborers, those with some skills. They ignore the average, everyday working class. The Knights of Labor believed in being inclusive. You could be skilled, you could be unskilled. You could be white, you could be black, you could be brown, you could be male, you could be female. Now, again, Terence Powderly believed in this. Now, there are some local, chapters of the Knights of Labor that were still racist, but as a national organization, they were non-discriminatory. They called for things like an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, something we're still fighting for in the 21st century, public ownership of railroads, abolition of child labor, a graduated income tax. Now, where they get really radical is what you see in your screen, which says ultimate goal, worker cooperatives. A worker cooperative, this is where they get really radical. It's still radical today. Because all the other things we can look at and say, okay, that makes sense, right? Equality of wages, non-discriminatory, 8-hour workday, no child labor, that makes sense. The worker cooperatives, though, would be that the workers themselves own the means of production. Now, let me show you how this works. When I was doing my research for my dissertation, I went to Berkeley, California, at University of California, Berkeley, to do some research in the library there. And while I was there, I wanted to get some food. So I found on Yelp a local pizza place on campus that was supposed to be really good. So I went there, and as I was there, I was reading some of the history of it, some signage they had up. And I found out that this pizza place had no one owner. In fact, this pizza place was owned by the employees. In other words, the harder each individual employee worked, theoretically, the more profit that would be split among all the employees. So there's no hierarchy of ownership here. You don't work hard at your job so the boss gets more money. In a worker cooperative, and the harder you work as employees, you all split the rewards. That's a worker cooperative. Now, of course, in the utopian society, this sounds great. In fact, this is the theoretical framework for communism, that the people own everything. They share and reap the benefits. Again, this is still radical today. But nonetheless, the Knights of Labor is going to grow drastically from 100,000 to 700,000 members. Unfortunately, after 1886, there's a big event in Chicago called the Haymarket Square Riot that's going to be blamed on radical labor unions, including the Knights of Labor. They had no part of it. That will cause their decline. And while U.S. history is guilty of usually teaching the Knights of Labor as a force in the Northeast, the reality is local chapters of the Knights of Labor are going to spread across the nation. And this idea of using strikes will begin to spread across the country, especially to the minds of California and the U.S. Southwest. And that's where we'll pick up next time in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.